Well, good morning and welcome to all, especially our guests that are here today. Your presence is a blessing. All of us now gathered here on this day, this Sunday, to offer our praise and thanksgiving before the Lord in the offering, the sacrifice, this Mass. It doesn't matter if it's cloudy and rainy outside, the light is in here. The light of Christ shining in here, no matter how dark or gloomy or stormy it might become. The light is always with us as we gather before the altar for the sacrifice of the Mass. Please know that this weekend in the parish we're having the annual Catholic Charities Appeal, and we have a representative of the Catholic Charities going to be speaking here in a few moments right after the homily. We'll have a second collection for people to make a pledge to support the work of the Catholic Charities of this diocese. Also, right after this Mass, we invite families with young children to check out the nursery. And that we're rebranding, think of it that way, our nursery on Sunday morning, the Good Shepherd Nursery for children ages 4 and under, in which we're going to introduce the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. So in addition to coffee and donuts, we have this going on as well right after this Mass. Also, we have the annual pet blessing. They'll be at 3 o'clock, rain or shine, in the parking lot. Just ask that all pets be on a leash or harness, no matter how large, no matter how small, all pets are welcome. Please know that I'm going to be leaving tomorrow, and I'll be gone all of next week, Monday through Friday. I'll be on retreat at Subiaco Abbey in Arkansas. It's the annual priest retreat for the clergy of this diocese. So I'll be there with more than 40 of my brothers in black. So please keep us in your prayers. The theme of the retreat is the Beatitudes, that our hearts are open, particularly in our priesthood, in living out the Beatitudes as your priest. And I'll be back about midday, hopefully on Friday, and you will certainly will be in my prayers. And also let you know that my Pistol Pete figure on my desk is now facing towards the wall. He's in timeout for the rest of the week. Another loss at home against another unranked team. Okay, again. So we will see, but he's in timeout, and hopefully that will all, we'll see what next Saturday brings. Louis Martin was born in 1823 in the Bordeaux region of France. He was one of 5 children, but he was the only one of those 5 to live past the age of 30. The other 4 died young. Louis, after much prayer and discernment, believed that he was being called by God to the vocation of religious life, and he entered an Augustinian monastery to be a friar. His time there was rather short. It seems he could not get a good handle on the Latin, and the Latin being offered in the daily prayers. So he was rejected by that community, realizing that was not his vocation. Afterwards, he became a watchmaker, and apparently a pretty good one too. He was making a good living. Zélie Marie Guerin, whose nickname was Zélie, was born in 1831 in the Oran region of France, and after much prayer and discernment, she believed that God was calling her to the vocation of religious life as well. She had an older sister that was a visitation nun, and Zélie tried to enter a convent of the Sisters of Charity of the St. Vincent de Paul. That too was short-lived. She was rejected by the community not because of inability to learn Latin, but because of health concerns. She had chronic issues with respiratory infections and also chronic headaches. So after that rejection, she became a lace maker, and apparently a pretty good one. She prayed after she had been rejected by the community that God would give her many children to which she would consecrate to God. And consecrate means to set apart for a sacred purpose. In answer to that prayer enters the watchmaker, Louis Martin. They met in March of 1858, and apparently sparks flew pretty quick. Within 90 days, they were married. July 12th, 1858. United as husband and wife in the sacrament of marriage, they vowed to love each other in Christ for better, for worse, in sickness and in health, as husband and wife until death do they part. And they had plenty of better and plenty of for worse, plenty of sickness and plenty of health. Zélie proved not only good at making lace, she proved even better at selling it, marketing it. You know, sometimes we see in magazines for cities like in Tulsa, they'll have like an edition 40 under 40 for Tulsa People magazine or something like that. They'll feature these up-and-coming entrepreneurs and people who are movers and shakers. If there had been a 40 under 40 magazine in her town, Zelly would have probably been featured in it. She was so good at what she did that Lewis basically quit his job. He sold his watchmaking business and he went to work for her. They were able to provide a solid financial living background, upbringing for their children, of which their children, they had 9. 7 daughters and 2 sons, for Zelly to consecrate to God. Of those 9 children, they buried 4 of them, 2 daughters and both sons, who either died in infancy or in early childhood. And Zelly herself died at the age of 45 of breast cancer in 1877. Within weeks after her death, Lewis sold the lace-making business and moved with his 5 young daughters to the city of Lisieux, which is in the Normandy region of France, to live with Zelly's brother and his family. And Lewis did something, well, you know, we're accustomed today that men, they might, in their home, they refer to as the man cave. You know, that's their space, maybe in the basement or part of the garage. Well, Lewis did something like that, but a bit different. It was up in the attic, and it wasn't a man cave. It was basically a prayer space. He went there to pray on a daily basis, read the scriptures. And his daughters were only allowed to come into that room to talk to him if they're going to talk about spiritual matters. He outlived Zelly by more than 2 decades. And the last 5 years of his life was marked by a great illness. He had not 1 but 2 strokes that left him partially paralyzed, left him an invalid. And he died in 1894 at the age of 70. As a married couple, Lewis and Zelly sought to fulfill that desire of her prayer, of creating a family in which all would see that they had been consecrated to God, that they were set apart for a sacred purpose. Of those 5 daughters who survived into adulthood, all of them entered the vocation of religious life. In living their life in Christ as a family, the way they did, their youngest child, Marie-Francoise Therese, said of her parents that God had blessed her with parents more worthy of heaven than of earth. It's a pretty high compliment. Now, you may not have heard of Zelly and Lewis, but you probably heard of their youngest daughter, the one that said that her parents are more worthy of heaven than of earth. Today we know her as Saint Teresa of Lisieux, Saint Teresa the Little Flower, one of the most beloved saints in modern times. Her parents, more worthy than heaven than of earth, were officially recognized or canonized as saints in 2015. They were canonized together as a married couple. That's the first time as a church we've ever done that. We have married couples who are recognized as saints, but the first time they were canonized together. And their feast day is July 12th, their wedding anniversary. You know, look around, we got a lot of space still on the walls here for more saints. So kind of maybe Lewis and Zelly might be a good candidate for that someday. We often mention or talk about them with couples preparing for marriage. Because you see, Lewis and Zelly, a reminder that saints, real saints, are not made out of wood, they're not made out of plaster, they're not just the subject of pious stories. They're made out of flesh and blood. And they face the same challenges in life, the same challenge to answer that call of holiness of being consecrated as we do. Lewis and Zelly knew rejection. They thought their vocation was one thing and it turned out to be another. Lewis buried all 5 of his brothers and sisters. 4 of his brothers and sisters, they buried Zelly and Lewis together, 4 of their children. He was a widower for more than 2 decades. They face the same challenges that we do in our life together, to live as a people consecrated to God in Jesus Christ. Today, the scriptures that greet us at this Mass, we are reminded as disciples that marriage and family are to be seen as a sacred vocation. Vocation, I mean the way of life that God calls us to, each and every one of us to live out the promises of our baptism. Marriage and family, we are told today, has been consecrated, set apart for a sacred purpose. In the culture that we live in today, we have largely lost sight of that consecration. And because we have, allow me to suggest that the real vocation crisis in the church today is not the priesthood or religious life, as we often hear. It is marriage and family, understood as a way of life consecrated to God, to live a life more worthy of heaven than of earth. Instead, the norm is that marriage is simply seen as like a default cultural thing. You get married, well, because that's what people do. Or you don't see value in marriage at all. We have an increasing number of people who are together living as husband and wife but are not actually married. They're living in cohabitation. What Jesus is calling his disciples to, what he calls us to today, as we hear in the book of Genesis, is that what God originally intended, that union between man and woman. The two are to become one flesh, one life, one consecration. And that's what Jesus reminds us of today in the gospel. Now, about the issue of divorce that he speaks of. Remember, Jesus is speaking to a Jewish culture in which, as I said recently, men were permitted to divorce their wives pretty much for any reason at all, the most trivial matters. A man could divorce his wife. A woman had no such rights under Jewish law. In the Roman world, the non-Jewish Roman world, lower-class men had similar power over their wives, but some things I've read recently is that for the upper-class women, the ones we think of the nobility of the 1%, they did have the right to divorce if they wish, and there are some of them that divorced so many times they bragged about it. That's what the Roman poet Seneca talked about. He said women, instead of talking about how long they'd been married, which anniversary they're celebrating, they bragged about how many divorces they'd racked up. That's the reality that Jesus is speaking to. Well, elsewhere in the gospel, Jesus does seem to make an exception concerning divorce when it involves what he refers to as an unlawful marriage. It is clear that he's calling disciples to a different standard of the meaning of marriage and family that is in the culture in which they live. What was true then is true today. Jesus teaching his disciples, teaching us as a church, not to give into the cultural norms, not to give into the hardness of our hearts when it comes to marriage and family, but rather to see them as a consecrated way of life. That's why we speak in the church, the family, as the domestic church, the forming of a community of faith. When two or more are gathered in my name, Jesus says, I'm in their midst. And to see the family as the domestic church of a life lived together in Christ, consecrated for that purpose. To see marriage more than a legal contract, more than a cultural practice, to see rather marriage and family as a sacrament. And a sacrament is that visible, living sign created by Christ to reveal God's love. Husband and wife and children together as one. One consecration, as we hear today in the letter of the Hebrews. And about marriage as a sacrament, a man and a woman married in Christ. That remains the same. Doesn't matter how civil law redefines marriage. Marriage as a sacrament, recognized in our church, will always remain the same. Because what Jesus does, the Word made flesh, is to take the most basic of human relationships, the family, and consecrates it into a means in which he is living in our midst. That's the meaning of the vocation of marriage and family. It's the vocation of Louis and Zélie Martin that they witnessed to, their flesh and blood, through all that, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, until death did they part. Through their intercession, may our families live in such a way as to be more worthy of heaven than of earth.